You are a Roman woman. Your husband, a gladiator, has just survived the arena. The crowd is still roaring. The air reeks of sweat, wine, and blood. You wait behind the iron gate as the victor is crowned with laurels, his chest still slick with another man's life. The arena sand is red beneath his feet, but the senators cheer as if holiness itself has descended on blood. You expect celebration, but dread it instead. You've seen what comes after, the processions, the banquets, the nights that follow. For some wives, their husband's survival meant the beginning of something darker. Fear, shame, and the paradox of survival. You love him, yet his victory makes you a prize in someone else's game. The torchlight flickers across marble. The metallic stench of blood and bronze mixes with the sweetness of spilled wine. The chants of drunken senators echo through the stone corridors, drowning out the trembling silence of wives waiting in the shadows. You close your eyes as the gate creaks open, realizing that for many gladiators' wives, victory meant another kind of punishment. Ritualized humiliation, forced participation in Rome's after-games of lust and dominance. Because in Rome, victory was not freedom, it was property reaffirmed. If this glimpse into Rome's forgotten shadows grips you, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice fuels more buried unearthings like this. Rome, the empire of marble, blood, and spectacle, thrived on contradiction. Behind its triumphal arches and golden amphitheaters lay a system where death was theater and desire was governance. Contemporary observers like Juvenal and Seneca hinted at the unseen consequences of these games, but archaeology has since confirmed their silence was not ignorance, it was fear. In Capua's gladiatorial ledgers, researchers found records of victory feasts, contracts binding wives to appear before patrons and priests as symbols of their husbands' endurance. The truth is simple and monstrous. Gladiatorial life did not end when the crowd dispersed. It continued in controlled brothels, ritual feasts, and elite gatherings where victors were paraded like breeding stock. The empire that mastered death had also perfected desire as another form of domination. The crowd's roar fades, but the machine of spectacle continues turning long after the last scream has died in the sand. The gladiator, still breathing, is no longer a man, he is an investment. The state records his name, his victories, his physical condition, and the number of surviving dependents. In Rome, nothing was wasted, not even pain. Each survivor of the arena entered another ledger, the libri munerari, catalogued like livestock. Their wives and companions, too, were noted, not as individuals, but as extensions of valor. Their worth was derived from proximity to violence. The Roman world loved to speak of virtue, virtus, a word rooted in manhood and conquest. But for every man elevated by the blade, a woman was drawn deeper into chains. A gladiator's victory was celebrated as divine favor, his endurance proof of Mars's blessing. And because Roman logic equated divinity with domination, the women connected to these men became living proofs of their owner's power. They were paraded, examined, and, in many cases, ritualized as part of the triumph. A lanista, the owner of gladiators, could lend or lease both fighters and their partners. Surviving tablets from Pompeii and Capua describe these arrangements in chilling euphemism, uxor victori, suitable for ceremonial duties. What that meant depended on who purchased the honor. Sometimes it meant standing at a banquet table beside a drunk senator. Sometimes it meant being forced to perform the ritual of fertility, a grotesque imitation of holy union before guests who toasted Rome's might. The victors were told it was tribute to the gods. The wives understood it as sanctioned violation. Archaeologists have found fresco fragments depicting such scenes. Garlanded women beneath laurel wreaths, flanked by men wearing gladiator helmets, watched by priests holding scrolls. For centuries, these images were mistaken for wedding celebrations. Only when translated graffiti nearby used the word ludicrum, performance, did scholars realize they were not marriages but reenactments staged for pleasure and politics. Inside the gladiatorial schools, control ran deeper than chains. Trainers monitored not only combat drills, but domestic life. A fighter's wife could not bear a child without permission. Pregnancy meant a temporary loss of value, and therefore profit. If she conceived, the child belonged legally to the lanista, to be raised as future labor or sold to fund new recruits. Families were assets, never households. Their tears were taxed, one inscription reads, and their wombs tithed. Behind closed doors, psychological warfare flourished. The men were told their wives' honor depended on their victories. The women were told their husbands' lives depended on their compliance. Fear became the empire's quietest weapon, no less effective than the sword. The system was self-sustaining, a pyramid of pain feeding Rome's appetite for spectacle. Even the emperor's games reinforced the illusion of consent. The celebrations after a victorious festival, the convivium triumphale, were spectacles of wealth. Senators arrived draped in purple, poets composed verses about strength and seed, and musicians played as if war itself were being serenaded. But behind the curtains, the wives of champions waited, silent and trembling, wearing perfumes provided by patrons who honored them for their men's courage. In one record from the reign of Commodus, a woman named Julia Silana is mentioned as the wife of a champion. The document states she was presented before the gods as the fruit of conquest. There are no further mentions of her. Historians suspect she was forced into a ritual that ended her life, a sacrifice euphemistically described as aeternum vinculum, eternal union. Commodus, obsessed with the divine image of Hercules, often required such performances to bless the games. It was systematic, deliberate, bureaucratically efficient. Every humiliation had a form, every degradation a signature. In the ledgers discovered beneath the Ludus Magnus, the great gladiatorial school beside the Colosseum, scholars found columns listing attendance at post-victory feast, followed by payments in amphorae of wine or bundles of silk. One even records a bonus for satisfactory conduct of dependents. Rome had perfected industrial-scale dehumanization centuries before the term existed. They had weaponized the most intimate parts of human life: marriage, love, celebration, turning them into tools of obedience. In this world, a kiss could be taxation, and a child could be collateral. And yet, through fragments of graffiti, small acts of rebellion appear. On one wall in Pompeii, a line scrawled by an anonymous hand reads, "He fought for Rome, I fight for his soul." Scholars believe it was written by a woman whose husband was a gladiator, perhaps one of the countless wives erased from the official stories. Still, survival had a cost. Those who endured often learned to play the role assigned to them, smiling in ceremonies, bowing before nobles, speaking praises of the empire that devoured them. Resistance could mean punishment not only for them but for their husbands, who were bound by contract to obedience. Rome's genius was not merely in the arena. It was in making the victims believe they were participants. The state called it honor. The crowd called it celebration. The women called it silence. As Rome expanded, so did the machinery of humiliation. In provincial arenas from Gaul to Africa, local governors replicated the capital's customs. Victory feasts became the empire's unofficial language of loyalty. Inscriptions found in Carthage, Ephesus, and Antioch describe honor rites for the wives of victors, always accompanied by gifts, oil, gold, or linen, and always ending in what one historian calls symbolic submission. The euphemism was the same everywhere, adorned for Mars. These ceremonies were not spontaneous indulgences. They were planned months in advance, often sponsored by senators seeking favor. An entire economy thrived on these after-games tailors, who sewed ceremonial veils, perfumers who crafted specific scents for purity displays, and scribes who recorded attendance. Each celebration reinforced the empire's central message. Rome's power extended into every chamber, every bed, every berth. The wives knew this. That's why many mutilated themselves to escape selection. Chroniclers mention women who cut their hair, scarred their faces with ash, or claimed illness on the eve of games. One wife of a Thracian fighter reportedly blinded herself with a heated needle so that no nobleman would look upon her. The Lanista fined her husband for the loss of aesthetic property. Others chose death. In Capua, archaeologists unearthed a mass grave near a gladiatorial dormitory, bodies of women buried with small jars of hemlock and letters carved into clay tablets. "Forgive me, beloved. I cannot stand before them." The carbon dating matches the year 1804 CE. the height of Commodus's reign, when the emperor personally performed in the arena, demanding divine tributes for his brothers of the sand. Even in death, their bodies were catalogued. The necropolis ledgers list them as household losses. To the empire, grief was another entry in the balance sheet. And still, there were those who resisted in subtler ways. In Rome's Subura district, the slum that birthed both slaves and heroes, gladiators' wives formed hidden networks, whispering warnings to newcomers, forging alliances with freedwomen, bribing scribes to alter records. These underground circles were later branded as witch cults by moralists like Suetonius and Tacitus. One surviving fragment from a senator's diary reads, "The wives of the games are restless again. They share poisons and prayers alike." But what Rome called witchcraft was often just desperation. It was women trying to reclaim agency in a world where even their husband's blood was state property. They spread coded graffiti circles of laurel leaves inverted, marks of mourning disguised as decoration. In one bathhouse, carved beneath a mosaic of Venus, the words survive. She rose, not as bride, but as warning. As centuries turned, the rituals grew normalized. Citizens brought their children to watch. Poets romanticized the ceremonies as symbols of fertility. The philosopher Seneca once wrote, "Through the victor's union, Rome is reborn." He likely meant it metaphorically, but the empire took it literally. Women became wombs of propaganda. The lex muneraria, a law regulating the games, even offered tax deductions for those who hosted honor feasts. In effect, the state subsidized exploitation. The spectacle of humiliation became public entertainment. One chronicle describes a senator hosting a triumphal night in which the wives of 3 victorious gladiators were made to kneel before the emperor's statue while musicians played hymns to Mars. The record ends with a chilling phrase, "The crowd approved." Pause and consider that. The crowd approved. Rome's greatest cruelty was not in the killing, it was in the applause that followed. The sound of thousands celebrating what they refused to see. The women learned this silence well. They became invisible even in daylight, their pain buried beneath layers of marble rhetoric. Archaeology continues to uncover their traces. In 2012, a dig beneath the Colosseum revealed a basement chamber lined with iron rings and shallow stone troughs. Initially assumed to be animal pens, analysis later showed residues of perfume and traces of human DNA female, aged between 20 and 35. The chamber's name, inscribed on a fragment, reads Cubicula Sacra, the sacred rooms. Historians now believe these were the preparation chambers for post-victory rites, the blessing, chambers where wives awaited their ceremonial role. And yet, even amid this horror, flickers of humanity persist. Some men refuse to play along. A surviving wax tablet from the Ludus Dacicus, a gladiator school, records a disciplinary fine for a fighter named Marcus Attilius who struck a nobleman after the man approached his wife. The penalty was death in the arena, but the record ends with a note, "He died with defiance," and the crowd cheered. A rare moment when conscience broke through spectacle. By the 4th century, Christianity began to erode Rome's appetite for the games, but not its structure of control. The arenas fell silent, yet the logic of ownership endured, transferred into domestic law, into the subjugation of women sanctified by marriage codes. The ghosts of the gladiators' wives lingered, not as martyrs, but as memories of a world that called submission sacred. Centuries later, their stories still surface. In inscriptions, in bones, in whispers of unearthed scrolls. Together they tell a single truth: the empire that worshipped power could not comprehend love. Rome's true genius was not architecture or conquest, it was the normalization of horror through beauty. Its poets gilded trauma with verse, its painters disguised cruelty in fresco, its lawmakers wrapped tyranny in ritual. The wives who dreaded victory celebrations were not exceptions, they were the rule, the invisible half of Rome's spectacle. They remind us that behind every triumphal arch there is a hidden door, and behind that door, a silence that never truly ends. The deeper one looks into Rome's records, the clearer the system becomes. What seemed like random cruelty was, in truth, a design, an economy of humiliation carefully calculated and sustained by law, profit, and faith. The empire's administrators reduced human experience to a series of ratios and returns. Every act of pleasure or pain had measurable value. Ledgers discovered near the Ludus Magnus speak of reproductive yield, replacement cost, and entertainment worth. These were not metaphors. The empire's bureaucrats treated gladiators and their families as renewable resources. To maintain a stable roster of fighters, the state encouraged selective breeding, pairing the strongest men with women deemed fertile and compliant. Bonuses were granted to lanistae whose stock produced sons fit for the arena. One column chillingly summarizes: to sustain 100 fighters, procure 250 dependents, allow 20% loss by childbirth, 10% by punishment, 15% by disease balance through acquisition. This was not war. It was arithmetic. The celebration feasts, once thought private indulgence, were part of this broader machinery. Rituals that humiliated wives also served to mark ownership transfers of human beings. When a victor was rewarded with freedom, his family often was not. The wife remained bound to the school until debts and taxes were paid. Sometimes years, sometimes forever. The victory meant survival, but not escape. Even religion became an accomplice. Roman priests invoked Venus and Mars over the bodies of women offered in sacred union, declaring that through such rites, Rome's strength would multiply. A surviving scroll from the Temple of Hercules Victor includes a chilling passage. Those who conquer with the sword must also plant seed, that the gods may favor the harvest of men. The words blurred devotion and violation so seamlessly that both believer and victim were trapped within the same illusion. And yet, what truly ensured the endurance of this system was its euphemistic beauty. The empire wrapped atrocity in aesthetics. Festivals adorned the victims with gold threads and rose petals. Choirs sang as they were led through colonnades. Inscriptions praised the bounty of Venus, the valor of Mars, the joy of victory. It was a theater of submission, ritualized, choreographed, publicly adored. The psychological brilliance of Rome lay not only in its brutality, but in its normalization. Every citizen participated, even unknowingly. Senators sponsored games, matrons attended feasts, poets wrote hymns to the eternal bride of conquest. What began as a perverse indulgence became a civic virtue. The people believed they were celebrating courage, when in truth they were worshipping control. The women who resisted were reclassified as mad or unclean. Imperial records list punishments for wives of the games who refused ceremonial duties, fines, flogging, or expulsion to labor camps. One account from Antioch describes 24 women executed for defiling the triumph. Their crime was refusal to smile. By the late 2nd century, the structure had achieved a kind of monstrous equilibrium. The arena fed the feasts justified the faith, and the faith sanctified the arena. An empire had turned its entire moral system into an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own humanity in the name of order. But beneath the marble and incense, rot was spreading. Every ledger that recorded a successful rite also whispered a cost. Families erased, souls hollowed, generations taught to mistake submission for sanctity. Rome was becoming a mirror of its own cruelty, reflecting back to itself a beauty built on screams. Pause and consider. Entire villages surrendered at the mere whisper of what awaited their daughters. They did not need legions to conquer anymore. Fear itself had become Rome's most efficient army. The machine's perfection was its own undoing. By reducing life to policy, Rome stripped even its victors of meaning. Gladiators who survived too long grew restless, haunted by what their victories cost. Chroniclers mention fighters who refused to raise their swords, knowing that every triumph condemned someone they loved to servitude. Some attempted escape, others turned their final combat into rebellion, dying on their knees rather than kneeling at the feast that followed. Yet even rebellion was commodified. The empire turned martyrdom into myth, statues into propaganda. One marble relief from the 3rd century shows a gladiator kneeling before a veiled woman, long believed to depict devotion. New analysis of the inscription reveals it to be a monument to obedience. The caption reads, "He accepted his reward as Rome commands." Systemic exploitation had become self-sustaining. The institutions that once needed chains now used culture as their binding force. The amphitheater, the temple, and the family were all parts of a single apparatus of control. The games were no longer just blood, they were philosophy. Citizens were taught that hierarchy was divine and submission a form of grace. Economic policy reinforced it. Slave markets operated alongside arena festivals, timed to ensure fresh influxes of captives. Wives and daughters of fallen fighters were auctioned under the same arches that once celebrated triumphs. Even the price system reflected Rome's moral decay. Young women fetched higher value immediately after victory seasons, proof that demand followed ritual. Legal codes caught up. The Digest of Ulpian, one of Rome's foundational law compilations, contains clauses permitting disciplinary correction of dependents for the maintenance of honor. Historians now interpret this as legal immunity for what we would call assault. To Rome, control was not cruelty, it was governance. Priests, too, rationalized it. They preached that every conquered body symbolized divine favor. Public humiliation was renamed pietas duti. Every lash, every command, every coerced smile became a sacred act reinforcing empire. The fusion of violence and virtue was complete. Atop this machinery sat emperors who saw themselves as gods. Commodus famously performed in the arena, calling himself the husband of Rome. His celebrations blurred the boundary between ritual and madness. One eyewitness, the historian Cassius Dio, wrote, "He believed the city his bride and its blood his dowry." Dio's words, once dismissed as metaphor, now read as chillingly literal. By then, no one questioned the feasts. They had become Rome's heartbeat, its rhythm of dominance and denial. To stop them would have meant confronting the truth that the empire's greatness was built not on discipline, but on desecration. When Christianity later rose and outlawed the games, it did not erase the mindset, only changed its vocabulary. The feasts ended, but the idea that power sanctifies pain endured. The arena's sand gave way to church altars. The laurel crown became a halo. The machinery of submission survived its empire. And so, the legacy of those wives, the ones who wept in silence, who feared victory more than death, lived on, buried not in ruins but in culture. Rome fell, but its rituals of dominance persisted wherever power demanded reverence, because the empire that mastered death had, indeed, perfected desire as another form of domination. And even now, in the stories we tell, in the glories we celebrate, echoes of their dread remain, faint but eternal, like the whisper of a crowd long silenced beneath marble dust. The amphitheaters are silent now. The marble seats where tens of thousands once howled for blood lie cracked and filled with weeds. Yet when the wind moves through their ruins, it sounds uncannily like applause, soft, hollow, eternal. Beneath that echo lies the unspoken truth. Rome did not only train men to kill, it taught entire generations to mistake domination for celebration. The wives of the gladiators are ghosts in that wind. Their names are gone, but their stories endure in traces. The burnt edges of scrolls, the indentations of styluses pressed too hard into wax, the graffiti of defiance scratched into plaster. Archaeologists find them buried beside their husbands' weapons, their bones twisted toward the west, as if reaching for something they were never allowed to hold. To the chroniclers, they were nameless dependents. To us, they are the measure of Rome's moral cost, because civilization's fragility is not seen in its architecture, but in what it chooses to forget. Rome's arenas became its cathedrals, its rituals became law, and its rhetoric of purity lingered long after its empire turned to dust. The ledgers that recorded victory feasts remain ink-faded but legible proof that bureaucracy can sanctify cruelty if enough people call it tradition. When modern historians read those scrolls, they often pause at one recurring phrase, "For the glory of Rome." It appears beside every expense, every death, every offering. Glory, an empire's most seductive lie. It justified everything from slaughter to silence. But for the women left behind the gates, glory was another word for grief. The echoes of their dread ripple forward through centuries. In every system that demands obedience disguised as devotion, in every culture that celebrates conquest but forgets compassion, Rome breathes again. The machinery that once turned victory into bondage never truly vanished. It evolved, quieter, more sophisticated, but built upon the same idea that power must always be adorned and suffering must always serve a story. And yet, remembrance is rebellion. To speak their names, even the ones history erased, is to deny the empire its final victory. It is to strip marble of its illusion and see the humanity buried beneath. So, if this history stirs something within you, rage, sorrow, or awakening, subscribe, share, and tell us where it struck deepest, because every time these forgotten shadows are brought to light, the silence weakens, and perhaps, somewhere in the dust of Rome, a soul long shackled finally rests.